The auctioneer knocked them down for $32, the whole starved lot of them, 48 goats with their ribs standing out like the staves of empty barrels, and the men, leaning on the pen rails, laughed so hard, one of them had to sit down in the dust. A young woman had raised her hand for animals. Nobody else would feed on land, nobody else would plow. In the worst summer the county had seen in 40 years. She did not laugh with them, she counted. 3 springs earlier, she had been counting too, only then, the numbers had all come out wrong. Her name was Della Marsh, and she was 24 years old. The spring her uncle died, and left her the West Quarter, which the family had always called the worst 160 acres in the whole valley. It was high ground, thin ground, all pale caliche clay and shelves of limestone that turned a plow blade like an insult. Her uncle Amos had grazed it lean for 30 years and buried 2 wives on it, and when the fever took him, the lawyers found no other kin who would sign for the debt that came with the deed. There was a mortgage on it of $410 held by the bank in Cottonwood, and taxes owed of $19, and a note at the mercantile of $31 for a wagon axle and a winter's flour. Della signed for all of it because she had nowhere else to be, and because a person alone learns quickly that a roof, even a bad roof, is a thing worth keeping. The county agreed among themselves, over their coffee and their fences, that a young woman alone could not hold that quarter through one hard year, let alone the run of hard years. Everyone could feel coming in the color of the sky. She moved into the low sodden timber house in April with a trunk of clothes, her mother's Bible, $11, and a milk cow named Prue, who was old enough to have opinions. The first thing she did was walk the whole 160 acres, slow, with a stick, the way her uncle used to. She was looking for what he had seen in it, because a man does not stay 30 years on ground he despises, without some private reason. She found the reason on the 4th day, though she did not know yet that it was a reason. On the north edge, where the land pitched down toward a dry draw, there was a shelf of gray limestone, the size of a barn floor, and along its lower lip, the grass grew a shade greener than anywhere else, and a single wild plum tree had rooted in a crack and lived. She stood there a long while, with the wind pushing at her skirt. Green grass in a dry country is a sentence in a language if you can read it. She could not read it yet, but she marked the place in her mind and walked on. The town of Cottonwood sat 9 miles east, a single street of false-fronted stores, and a bank with a stone step worn hollow. Della went in that first month to make herself known, because a person alone cannot afford to be a stranger, and strangers are what get cheated. She met the banker, a soft, heavy man named Hollis Cruz, who wore a watch chain across a belly that had never missed a meal, and he took her small, dry hand in his 2 large, moist ones and told her, with all the warmth of a man laying out a trap, that she must not hesitate to come to him, that a girl in her situation needed a friend who understood business, and that when the burden grew too great, as burdens did, he would see her right. He said it kindly. Kindness, Della was learning, is sometimes only greed that has combed its hair. She met better people too. There was an old man named Otto Reinhold who farmed the quarter east of hers, a German who had come over as a boy 40 years before and still shaped his English like clay that would not quite hold the mark. He came the second week with a loaf his wife had baked and a wedge of hard cheese, and he stood in her doorway and looked past her at the bare front room and said, "Only the land. It does not care who is standing on it. It cares only who is paying attention." Then he tipped his hat and went home. Della thought about that sentence for a long time, the way you keep turning a stone in your pocket. The land does not care who is standing on it. It cares only who is paying attention. She did not know it then, but the old man had handed her the whole of it, the key to everything that was coming, wrapped in 11 plain words. That first year taught her the arithmetic of hunger. She had $11 and a cow. The cow gave milk she traded in town for flour and coffee and a little kerosene. She put in a garden of beans and squash and potatoes in the one low corner where the soil ran deep, and she hauled water to it in buckets from the tank her uncle had dug, and she learned that a woman could work until her hands went as rough as bark, and still the numbers at the end of the month came out short by $1 or $2. She paid the mercantile note down to 20. She could not touch the mortgage. She lay awake counting, subtracting, moving small sums from one imaginary pile to another, and the piles never grew. But she did not despair, because despair is only arithmetic. A person has stopped correcting. She adjusted. She watched. She began, without quite meaning to pay attention the way the old man had told her. And paying attention is a habit that pays the patient one strange, quiet dividends. The dividend that first year was the ledge of limestone on the north edge. All through a dry June, she noticed that the green strip below it stayed green when the rest of her grass went to straw. She dug at the base of the shelf one evening with a mattock sweating, and 2 feet down the clay turned dark and cool and wet against her fingers. And when she pressed her palm flat into the hole and held it there, water rose slow around her wrist. Not a flood, not even a trickle you could see run, but water, seeping steady out of the rock where the ledge held back the little rain the country ever got, and let it out drop by patient drop into the earth below. She sat back on her heels in the dark, with her muddy hand held up in front of her face like something she had caught, and she understood, all at once, that her uncle had known. That was why he stayed. The worst 160 acres in the valley had, hidden under its ugliest feature, a spring that did not know how to quit. She told no one. She banked the knowledge low in herself, like a coal under ash, because a person alone learns that the world will take a thing from you the moment it learns the thing is worth taking. The trouble was that a slow seep under a rock is not a crop and does not pay a mortgage. She could not sell water. She could barely see. She spent the winter thinking on it, and the answer, when it came, arrived on the wind one raw February afternoon in the form of a smell and a sound. She could not place. A high complaining bleat carried 9 miles from the cottonwood stockyards. There was to be a distress sale in April, old Reinhold told her, tapping his pipe. A rancher named Puckett, to the south, had overstocked Boer goats on burnt-out range bedding. The rains would come, and the rains had not come. And now the man was ruined, and the whole herd of them was to be sold off starving, because it was cheaper to sell them near dead than to keep feeding them toward the grave. Nobody wanted them. Goats, the valley men agreed, were a nuisance, a poor man's animal, a thing that ate a fence and gave nothing back but trouble. But Della had been paying attention. She knew 3 things. The laughing men did not trouble to know. She knew a goat could live on brush and thorn and weeds that would starve a cow. She knew a goat came into milk fast and bred twice a year and threw twins. And she knew that on her worst 160 acres there was 1 green strip of grass and 1 rock that leaked water without cease. Brush she had in plenty. Water she had in secret. What she did not have was stock cheap enough to buy, and here was a whole herd about to be given away for the price of the hauling. So on the 2nd Saturday of April, she rode Prue, bareback, the 9 miles into Cottonwood, with every dollar she owned, knotted in a handkerchief, which was $38 saved across a year of doing without, and she stood at the back of the crowd at the stockyard pen and looked at the animals. They were a sorry sight, God's truth. 48 Boer goats, the big white-bodied red-headed kind, gaunt to the bone, their coats staring and dull. 3 or 4 too weak to stand, the auctioneer could hardly work up a bid. A cattleman offered $1 for the lot, meaning to boil them for tallow and dog meat, and the crowd laughed. Della lifted her hand and said, $32, clear, and the whole pen fell quiet, and then broke into that big cruel valley, laughter and Hollis Cruz. The banker, who had come to watch the ruin of Puckett, the way such men enjoy a hanging, turned and saw her, and smiled with all his teeth. You'd have done better, girl, he called out, to throw your money in the creek. At least the creek's honest. She did not answer him. Being right, she was learning, is its own kind of reply, and it does not need to be spoken until the world is ready to hear it. She paid her $32, and she had 6 left, and she drove her 48 walking skeletons, the 9 long miles home, through the dark, losing not one, because she stopped every mile to let the weak ones rest, and carried 2 kids across her own shoulders like sacks of meal. That first summer with the goats was the hardest labor of her life and the beginning of her deliverance. both at once, and the two things were not separate. She rose before light every day, and she did not stop until the stars came out. She penned them at night against the coyotes in a brush corral she built with her own hands, hauling deadfall and thorn, until her forearms were a map of scratches. She grazed them by day out along the draws and the rocky slopes where the mean tough brush grew. The shinnery and the sumac and the bitter weeds the county had cursed for a generation, and the goats, who did not know they were supposed to be dying, ate it all with a will and began, slowly, to fill out. And every evening, she drove them up to the north ledge and let them drink at the little pool she had dug and cribbed with flat stones at the foot of the seep, and the water rose to meet them, just as fast as they could take it down, all summer. While 9 miles east, the town creek shrank to a string of stinking puddles, and the ranchers began to sell off cattle they could no longer water. By the end of that first summer, the change in the herd was a thing that could not be hidden, and Della learned that success kept secret is only a heavier kind of loneliness. The does came into milk. She had more milk than Prue had ever dreamed of giving, rich goat's milk, and she made cheese of it, pressing it in a wooden mold Reinhold carved for her, aging it on a board in the coolest corner of the sod house. She sold the first cheeses in town, and the storekeeper's wife pronounced them French, which, in Cottonwood, was the highest praise a food could get, and bought all Della would bring. The does bred in the fall and in the cold end of winter. They threw kids, most of them twins. 31 new goats born onto a place the whole valley had written off, and Della sat up through the freezing nights of kidding season with a lantern, pulling breech births with her thin, strong hands, warming near dead newborns against her own body inside her coat, venting, always counting. And for the first time in her life, the numbers at the end were larger than the numbers at the start. She paid the mercantile note off in full that second spring, and watched the storekeeper's face when she laid the coins down. She paid the taxes. She rode to the bank in Cottonwood, and paid Hollis Cruz $60 against the mortgage, and he took the money with a smile that had gone a little thin at the corners, and he asked her, too casually, how a girl was watering that many head with the whole country burning up around her. She told him she managed. He said he had heard she managed very well, and there was something in the way he said it, a soft menace under the fat kindness, that made her ride home the long way and check twice that her corral gate was tied. The land does not care who is standing on it, old Reinhold had said, but men, Della was learning, care a great deal, and the thing they care about most is a thing that works when their own things have failed. Hollis Cruz had begun to wonder about her water, and a banker who wonders about your water is a coyote wondering about your gate. The third summer was the one the old-timers would tell about, for the rest of their lives. The summer the drought came down, like the flat of God's hand, and did not lift for 140 days. It did not rain in April, and it did not rain in May, and, by the 1st of June, the whole valley knew this was not a dry spell, but a judgment. The Cottonwood Creek quit entirely, and the tanks cracked into plates of curled clay, and the range went the color of old bone. The cattlemen who had laughed at Della sold their herds for pennies to buyers who came out from the railhead like vultures, and those who could not sell in time watched their cattle die, standing up, bawling for water, along fences that led nowhere. Reinhold's well sank so low he was hauling water for his family by the barrel. Puckett, the man whose ruin had started it all, hanged himself in his empty barn, and the valley went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Hunger changes a town. It strips the manners off people and shows you the bone of what they are. And in some it shows generosity, and in others it shows the coyote. And you cannot always guess in advance which will be which. And on the worst 160 acres in the valley, the ledge spring did not fail. It slowed. Della watched the little pool with her heart in her throat all through July, and the level dropped, and the flow thinned. But it did not quit. Because a spring, fed by rain that fell in years gone by, does not care what the sky is doing this particular summer. It gives out what the deep rock has been saving, patient for a long time. Her goats were fat and sleek and watered while the country died, and her does milked heavy and her cheese cellar filled, And word of this got around the way word does when people are desperate, and the town's laughter turned first to disbelief, and then to a kind of sullen fury. Because it is easier to believe a thing is witchcraft, or luck, or theft, than to admit you were a fool to mock it. Some said she'd found her uncle's hid money, some said worse. And Hollis Cruz stopped wondering about her water and began, quietly, in the back room of his bank, to make a plan to own it. He came out to see her in the last week of July in a buggy, sweating through his good coat, and he sat with her on the shady side of the sod house and drank a dipper of her cool spring water like a starving man, and could not keep the greed from his face while he drank it. Then he told her in his softest voice that he had bad news. He said that in reviewing the old accounts, her late uncle's accounts, he had discovered a lien, an unrecorded second note of $200 that Amos had signed years back, and that with the interest it now came to $280, and that it was due, sadly, in 30 days. And that, of course, a girl alone in times like these could never raise such a sum, and that rather than see her turned out in the road, he would, as her friend, be willing to take the west quarter off her hands entire, forgive the whole debt, and pay her $50 besides, which was more, he said, than the place was worth to any sane man. He had the paper right there. He unfolded it on his fat knee. Della took the paper and read it slowly, because a person alone learns to read every word twice, and she saw that it was a forgery, and not even a clever one, for the signature on it was spelled Amos, with 2 M's, and her uncle, who had little schooling, had nonetheless spelled his own name right on every true document she owned. But she did not say so. She folded the paper back along its creases and handed it to him and said only that she would need to think, and that she would come to town before the 30 days were out. Cruz smiled and heaved himself into his buggy, well pleased, believing he had frightened her, believing, as such men always do, that a person alone is a person weak. And Della stood in her doorway and watched his dust go, and inside her the coal she had banked so long began at last to glow. She did not think first of the courts, because the courts were 40 miles away, and slow and cost money she did not have, and were, more often than not in that country, the plaything of the very men who had money. She thought instead of what she had that Cruz did not understand, which was not the water only, but what the water had made her. She had spent 3 years watching the quiet economy, the valley ignored, and now she saw the whole shape of it laid out plain. The town was dying of thirst, their creek was gone, their wells were sand, their cattle were dead or sold. Their children were sickening on bad brown water hauled from the last foul holes. And she, the girl they had laughed at, sat on a rock that gave clean, cool water without cease, more than her goats could drink, running to waste down the draw every single day. She had been so schooled by loneliness to keep her coal banked under ash that it took old Reinhold to say the thing out loud. He came on his weary mule to warn her that Cruz was telling it all over town, that she was hoarding water while good families suffered, poisoning the valley against her, before he took her land, and Reinhold said, wiping his face, "One person alone cannot fight a whole town, Della." And Della looked at him a long moment and said, "Then I will not be one person alone. I will give them the one thing he is trying to make them hate me for." What she did next, the valley never forgot. She did not hide her spring, and she did not sell it dear, though she could have named any price and the desperate would have paid it, and by the arithmetic of pure greed, she could have grown rich off her neighbor's thirst in a single month. She did the opposite. She sent word by Reinhold's, and by the storekeeper's wife, and by every mouth she could reach, that the ledge spring on the marsh quarter was open to any family in the valley that needed water. Free, as much as they could haul, so long as they came peaceable and took only what they needed, and let the stock drink first. And they came. They came in wagons and on foot with every barrel and jug and kettle they owned. Whole families, the same men who had laughed at the stockyard, now standing hat in hand at her gate, and she showed them the pool and the cribbing, and let them fill their vessels, and she asked nothing. And she watched their faces change from shame to wonder, to something that in a hard country passes for love. A woman whose baby had been sick on bad water, wept into Della's shoulder. The cattleman, who had bid $1 for the whole herd, stood at the spring and could not meet her eye, and finally said, "Lo, I was wrong about you." And Della said, "No, you were wrong about the goats, and let it go at that, because generosity that has to be paid for in another man's humbling is not generosity, but a second kind of greed." And that was how it stood, the whole town owing its very water to the girl they had scorned. When Hollis Cruz rode out on the last day of the 30 to take her land, and found 40 wagons in her yard, and half the valley drinking at her spring, he climbed down red-faced and flustered, and blustered out that this was all very fine, but the debt was the debt, and the paper was the paper, and the law was the law, and he waved his forged note over his head, where everybody could see it. Della stepped up onto the flat stone at the head of the spring, where they could all hear her, and she did not raise her voice, because a person who has waited 3 years to speak has no need to shout. She said, "Mr. Cruz claims my uncle owed him $200 on a note." She said, "My uncle's name was Amos Marsh, spelled with 1 M, as it is on his deed and his Bible and his grave marker, which some of you dug." She said, "Hold up your paper, Mr. Cruz, and show these good people how my uncle spelled his own name, says." And she said, "And while you're about it, tell them how you knew, back in July, before you'd ever seen my books, that the debt with interest came to exactly $280, unless you were the one who wrote the number." Cruz stood there in the hot sun, with the paper shaking in his fat hand, and the whole valley looking at him, the whole valley that owed its life that summer to the very water he had come to steal. And he had no answer, because there is no answer a man can give to a truth that everybody in earshot has already known in their bones about him. Somebody laughed, and it was not the cruel valley laughter of 3 springs before. It was worse for him than that. It was the laughter of people who have just watched a big man make himself small. The cattleman took the forged note gently out of Cruz's fingers and read the misspelled name aloud, slow, so all could hear. And then he tore it in 4 pieces and let them fall, and the paper scattered across the grass like startled birds. Hollis Cruz got back in his buggy without a word and drove off east toward town. And within the year, the news came round that the bank examiners had found other papers of his that did not spell right, other little liens on other lonely people, and that he was gone from the county for good, and no one grieved. The rains came back the next spring, as rains do, and the creek ran again, and the tanks filled, and the grass came green over the whole valley, and the memory of that killing summer settled into the ground like the water itself. But some things had changed for good, and did not change back. Della Marsh paid off the true mortgage on the West Quarter, in full that autumn, $410, mostly in goats and cheese, and the money the railhead buyers now paid gladly for Boer stock, that everyone in 3 counties had heard could thrive on rock and thorn. She had 200 head by then, and could not have kept them alive that dry year on any other place, and every rancher who had watched his cattle die now wanted goats, and every one of them came to Della because she had the only breeding stock in the country descended from animals that had already proven they knew how to live. She could have charged them dearly. She priced them, fair a little under fair, to the ones who had helped haul her stones and mend her corral in the bad time, and a good deal under fair to Reinhold, to whom she gave outright the pick of the herd, and would hear no argument about it, for the old man had given her the one true sentence that started everything. There was a boy, too, that I have not told you of, a thin, quick orphan named Sam, who had come with his family to haul water that terrible July, and had simply never quite left, hanging about the goats, learning their names, which he made up himself, and which stuck, so that Della found herself calling a big, fine buck Emperor, because a 9-year-old had decided it. She fed him and taught him, and by his people, who had lost near everything, were glad enough to let the boy stay on, where there was work and food, and a person who paid attention to him. He was no kin to her and never would be, but he was hers, all the same, in the way that matters. And she taught him what Reinhold had taught her, to walk the land slow and read what it was saying, and to keep his own coal banked until the world was ready. He is an old man now himself, and it is partly from him that this tale comes down. Della Marsh lived out her life on the worst 160 acres in the valley, which had somehow become the best, and she never married and never seemed to want to. And if the town thought that strange, it had long since given up thinking her wrong about anything. She built a good stone house at last, with the spring piped right into the kitchen, the first running water in that end of the county, and she planted an orchard below the ledge, where the wild plum had shown her the way, and in dry years and wet the little pool at the foot of the gray rock never once failed her, because she had understood, before anyone else, what her uncle understood, and what the laughing men could not. A thing is not worthless because it is scorned. It is only waiting on someone patient enough to see what it can do. The land does not care who is standing on it. It cares only who is paying attention. She had paid $32 for 48 starving goats, and everyone had laughed. And the goats had led her to the water, and the water had carried a whole valley through the killing time. And in the end, the girl alone had not stood alone at all, because the one who gives freely in the drought is never, ever thirsty for friends. And that, said the old man who told it to me, is the only arithmetic that ever came out right the first time.